100% right, every time. The McClaskey Excellence Institute brings you The Operations Experts, a podcast with hosts David McClaskey and Billy Schaefer. Delight your customers, reduce errors, and increase repeat business. Take your operations from ordinary to extraordinary. Welcome to the Operations Experts podcast, where we talk with leaders on how they're achieving world-class results in their organization. I'm David McClaskey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Billy Schaefer. And today, we're going to discuss how a company keeps a focus over multiple years on an effort to be world-class excellence. It is a thrilling story, and to tell this story, a person who was actually part of it and lived it, Joe Alexander. And let me tell you a little bit about Joe. How you doing?
I'm doing great.
And I'm just going to lead in, and I had a pleasure to know Joe for over 15 years, and it's just a fabulous person to know. Let me tell you a little bit about him. So Dr. Joe Alexander, two titles to remember. These are the ending titles, then I'll tell you the ones that got him there. A professor emeritus of the Massey College of Business at the Belmont University, and Dean Emeritus at the Monfort College of Business in the University of Northern Colorado. Now, most of the story we're going to talk about today is about the second one, the Dean Emeritus of the Monfort College of Business in the University of Northern Colorado. But let me tell you a little bit about Joe, because it helps to hear the background as you hear him talk. He's had over 40 years of experience in higher ed, but the key is half of it's been as an instructor and half of it's been as a leader. Mm-hmm. He's earned an MBA and a doctorate from the University of Memphis. He's the past president of the Midwest Business Deans Association, so even among his fellow deans, he's a leader. He's been involved with Baldrige for a long time, the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. He was their foundation director for a few years and a trustee. He's also an author of a book, Start to Finish. It's not just business, it's personal. And most importantly, Joe's a Christian husband, father, and now grandfather. And so roles to learn all the way. But I want to get into his dedication for excellence, because it's like you just can't get near Joe, that things aren't getting better already. And he is actually a firm believer in systematic process improvement. He's always doing it. I don't know of any organization that I've heard of that he's been involved in that isn't better because he was involved in it. He's got that reputation for using performance excellence through consensus and team building and getting things to happen. And he personally sometimes just gets in and does it. He's a Six Sigma black belt and a Fulbright fellow. Now, for the story today, what we're going to be talking about on this one, this has got to do all the way back in 2004. So 12 years ago, Joe led a faculty and professors and student leaders in the university community when he was dean of the Monfort College of Business or the University of Northern Colorado. He led them to win the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. Mm-hmm. This is the only, in the 36-year history of Baldrige, this is the only college of business that has ever won the Baldrige Award. So think of all the famous business colleges. There's only one that's won it. Mm-hmm. And it's from the University of Northern Colorado. And Joe was the dean at the time that actually won that. But it didn't just happen and start with Joe. It actually started before him, but that was the culmination. And Joe's going to tell us that story. And Joe, would you tell us, because I know a lot of our listeners have said, how do we keep a focus? And sometimes they're talking about a focus for 1 or 2 months. You kept the focus for around 20 years or so. Could you tell us how this happened?
Absolutely, David. Thank you for those kind words, generous introduction. And you said we've known each other, I think you said 11 years. It only seems like 11 years. We actually have known each other for far longer than that, right? And David's one of the individuals, in fact, the key individual, I would say, who was responsible for coming in when we were to a point where we thought, okay, we think this is the way to move forward and to get better. We have this new framework called Baldrige that we were teaching at a very surface level to our students, He was the one who came in and said, okay, here's how you actually apply this to actually make your organization better. And so we listened to you, thankfully, in terms of your advice on things. And as good teachers do, you didn't just come in and tell us what to do. You asked us lots of questions. And
Well, thank you.
the
Thank
more
you.
questions you asked, the more that we took a step back and thought, well, that's interesting. How could we answer that question? And so we would scurry around and work, usually over the weekend. I think that's may come out later in the podcast today. And by the time we would come back the next Monday morning, then we thought we had an answer for how we could do that better. And then he would say, "Okay, seems like they've answered that one. Now let's move to the next one or whatever." So it was a cyclical process of you asking questions, us working to figure out an answer that worked, because you didn't make it easy in terms of those things. And then for us to try to implement that and say, okay, what's the next one? And so we systematically worked our way through those different criteria until we had what we thought was something that we're starting to get this now a little bit higher and higher each time that we try to answer those questions. So just to take it back to the beginning,
Yeah,
I
and just to build on that, I
yeah,
just have to because it was just so amazing. It's one thing to ask questions, it's another thing to answer them. So we would come with these fairly deep level system questions, like on a Thursday or Friday, and by Monday, Joe will have worked it all out, and by Thursday, he would have it fully implemented in the college, and
yeah,
we would just do that week after week after week, and I'm going, I mean, most of the leaders I'd work with, each one of those would be monthly cycles.
yeah.
And Joe, this was like, well, we did it over the weekend and we got it implemented and fully established. So it just amazing implementation.
So some listeners are probably listening to that and saying, "Well, we understand Joe better now because Joe had no life." So basically, all we were doing at the time, and again, just to be clear, this wasn't just Joe, as you'll well remember. When David would come in and meet with there was an entire conference table of our leaders sitting around there,
Mhm,
and we were all trying to think our way through this and ask each other questions. So when David would leave the call, because usually it was by a phone call that we were doing this, when he would leave, then that's when we began to say, okay, how can we? And so it was very much a team effort. Let me go back a little bit to the beginning because we probably
mhm,
skipped a lot of the
if you would.
important groundwork in terms of laying the foundation for all that. I think my job, and again, maybe it's just based upon what, different people have different skills, but I think my job was actually the easier of the three leaders, two of whom preceded me in that role. The two other deans who had been before me, because there really had only been three deans for the first, I think it was 23 years of the college's existence. Those first two deans, in particular, the first one was the turnaround artist. He was the one who came in and said, "Ooh, I'm looking at where I'm a faculty member." Once he was appointed dean, he said, "We are, if we're just being honest, we're not all that good right now." Uh, we were we were an institution like a lot of organizations do, I think, that are trying to figure their way forward and figuring out how they can reach some goals that they've set for themselves. For us, the goal that had been set was for us to grow. That's what most colleges and universities are interested in. They're not concerned about student satisfaction. They're not concerned about parents and other stakeholders nearly as much as they're concerned about meeting their enrollment targets,
Mhm.
because that's what drives the bottom line for a university. And so I think that first dean came in and said, wow, we are growing. In fact, we had one of the largest MBA programs in the US back in the early 80s, but we weren't good. I mean, we were,
Huh.
there were, you mentioned the University of Northern Colorado. There was, there was a time I'm a little bit embarrassed to say where we were known as the University of No Credit. This is not just our college, but as the
Oh
entire
my,
university,
oh my.
because we were what's called a credit hour mill. Basically, we're pumping out students and graduates and producing credit hours, but I don't, a lot of us were not proud of what we were doing, other than the fact we were
Wow.
making a lot of money for the institution. So this dean took a step back and he started a very important tradition for the college. He said, okay, we weren't all that big. We had maybe 40 faculty, I think it was at the time. So he said, I'm going to invite, when he first started his deanship, I'm going to invite all of the faculty over to my house and we're going to have a powwow. We're going to sit down and we're going to figure out what we want to be when we grow up. They pulled out the consummate example of a planning meeting tool, a flip chart, and they wrote down people's ideas about what they could do. And I think secretly, I think this was Bill Duff. I think he probably had some ideas about what he wanted to do, but it was, you know, to use Jim Collins' example of getting people on the bus. I think he was smart enough to know that, okay, this isn't going to go anywhere if it's basically just me ruling through fear and intimidation. Let's get other people on that bus. And so he waited and continued to work through things until he had all of the faculty buying into the idea of a BHAG. This is before it was called a BHAG. He said, let's figure out what we can do that would make a huge difference in this college. And what we're going to do is we're going to work to obtain national accreditation, basically a certification for our business schools. At the time, there was a group called ACSB International, it still exists today. But it was a much more of a limited number of schools that were able to achieve that. It's about the top 10% business schools in the US. So he said, what if we did this? And this is our BHAG, and everybody bought in. So over the next probably 6 years, I guess it was, they set about making the changes that would allow them to meet those criteria. It doesn't sound that dissimilar, does it, in terms of the Baldrige framework? They were
No.
working toward a set of standards to be able to move things forward. And as they did that, they began to make progress, but they started having to make tough decisions. And one of the tough decisions was they said, you know, we're not resourced to do everything for everyone. We need to take a step back, and we need to jettison some of these programs that are not particularly important to us being a top quality business school, and maybe are stretching our resources so thin that we're not able to produce the level of quality we want to if we keep everything. So they
Mhm.
made a very difficult decision. You know, most business schools build their brand, if you will, on the backs of their MBA programs and the reputation of that
Mhm.
MBA degree. So they said, we are going to do something. We're going to do the opposite. If you've seen the Seinfeld episode where George Costanza, who's been a failure at everything he's ever tried,
Mhm.
he finally says, you know, everything I've done leads to failure. What if I tried doing the opposite? And sure enough, because it's television, sure enough, as he begins to make those changes and does the opposite of what his instincts would tell him, he becomes successful. Okay. They started doing the same thing, I think, even back then. And they got rid of what was one of the largest MBA programs in the US. And sure enough, they started seeing the needles begin to move on the metrics they were chasing. Their learning results started getting better. The faculty who had been going out and flying all over the US to do these MBA programs on Air Force bases around the US, they weren't as tired anymore. So they could pour more of their energy into their undergraduate students. And said, you know, there's another change we need. We're still trying to do too much. What if we collapsed everything into a single undergraduate degree and we worked at being the best we can in the state of Colorado at the undergraduate, serving undergraduate students? Oh,
Wow.
no, that's a novel mission to pursue. But it's also one they said, I think if we go this direction, we'll be able to actually achieve the things we want to achieve in terms of the quality that we're seeking. So they made those changes. So when I arrived as this green little faculty member out of a doctoral program back in 1990, a lot of the heavy lifting had already been done, and they were actually well on their way to achieving that accreditation, which they achieved in 1992, only 2 years after I got there. So the hard work, I think, was actually turning the ship around and starting to get some momentum. You know how hard it is cutting
Mhm.
things. Nobody in
Mhm.
higher ed cuts anything. They just add things, right? So
Mhm.
basically he did that. And
Now,
then,
let me see if I understand. This started 23 years ago, and this
yeah,
was the
well,
first of the
20
3 deans you're talking about.
23 years prior to when I left. So this is basically
Mm.
starting 40 years ago at this
40
point.
years ago. Okay,
Yeah,
40
about
years ago.
1984.
Okay,
So when the
1984, and in 2004, you won the Baldrige Award. So
right.
that's the time frame we're really concentrating from
Right.
84 to 2004. Okay.
So real quickly, just to kind of narrow the narrow the story a little bit, you ask about how many deans. He left in 1994 because he was tired. He had been doing that for 10 years, fighting all those battles.
Right.
But the saving grace, I think, was that his associate dean had been there with him the entire time, and he had
Mhm.
lived through part of all that. He had helped build that culture. And so when I came in to be the assistant dean in 1994, because I was looking to try some new and different things,
Mhm.
well, I had 4 years of experience in that culture. I'd bought in.
Mhm.
I wanted
Mhm.
to do what they were doing. I believed in that mission, vision, and values. And so when the associate dean got selected to be the new dean, he pulled me in to be his associate dean, and so we had that continuity that you were talking about
Ah.
earlier.
Now,
But
was that part of a plan for
uh,
continuity?
I don't know that it was part of a plan. It wasn't part of my plan because I didn't know enough to know what was being pursued, right? I was a junior faculty member when all this began, but I suspect that the first dean thought, I built all this. I want this to continue. And I don't want to stop just because I take a step back. And so I think he had probably been preparing and encouraging this other individual, Bob Lynch, to be able to step in and do that. But Bob did the same thing that Bill had done.
Mhm.
He invited all of the faculty over to his house. We were bigger at that point, believe it or not. We had grown. And so instead of doing it on one night with one flip chart, I remember because I had to cook the chicken for these events on his grill in the backyard. We did it 3 nights with 3 flip charts, and we still accumulated everybody's ideas. And then the next thing that came up for the BHAG is like, well, New Dean's got to do something different because the other thing's already done.
And the BHAG is the big, hairy,
That's the
audacious
big,
goal.
big, hairy, audacious goal. And so I said, okay, well, accreditation's already done. What if we set out to become a named business college? Which, if you think about it, business schools, it's the Mendoza College at Notre Dame, and a lot of these
Mhm.
major business schools have a name on them that
Mhm.
isn't just because they said we like that name. It's because you went out and found a major benefactor to donate lots and lots of money to you to be able to
Mhm.
put that name on the business school. So it does
Mhm.
two things: it gives you resources, but it also gives you a distinction in terms of branding. So
Mhm.
he said, "What if we do that?" And this again based on faculty input. Well, lo and behold, he does that within the next 5 years. And so that's where the Monfort name came from, is he had a $10+ million gift that was given by the Monfort family to be able to do this. And he called it margin of excellence funding. We would get roughly, we started out, I think, 500,000 a year that we would get to be able to do the things that the state's budget wouldn't allow us to otherwise do. So again, it's a resource for getting better. 7 years goes by. He's
So
tired.
this is a very intentional strategy.
Very intentional strategy by this point, and we knew at that point I had bought in, and I knew what we were doing, and obviously he knew what he was doing. We said, "Okay, after 7 years, okay, well, that BHAG's done. I'm gonna go back to the faculty." So each of these 2 leaders were still on our
Oh,
faculty. So each
wow.
dean who became dean had somebody else who was still there. You talk about
Oh,
boards where
wow.
you past
Mhm.
chair, right, kinda
Mhm.
thing. This is
Mhm.
a past dean who's still there on the faculty that you've got as a resource to be able to go to when you have questions about things.
Right.
So now there are 2 of them that are in fact, I still remember the day after I had become dean, and they walked in my office very serious like,
With both of them together.
both of them together, and asked if they
Ah.
could talk to me. I thought, "Oh, no, what did I screw up?" And this was probably 2001, maybe early 2002, and they sat down really seriously, and they said, "Okay, Joe, we just want you to know that we've talked, and between the 2 of ourselves, we want you to know that we have every size of clothing for you to use if you need based on the size you are now and the size you will someday be once you grow into the job." And sure enough,
Oh,
being
ouch.
required a lot of meals and a lot of, calling on potential donors and things, and you ate a lot probably as a result of that.
Mhm.
And so we had a good laugh, but both of them had put on a few pounds by that point, let's just say. So it was a meaningful exercise. But we did that. I invited all the faculty over to my house. We were bigger still. We had 4 nights and 4 flip charts. But I'm a
Oh my
little bit
gosh.
sweating at this point, because I'm thinking, run out of BHAGs here. I'm not sure what else there is out there that would arise to the level of either a national accreditation, a named business college. Everything I could think of seemed like, man, that kind of
Mhm.
pales in comparison.
Mhm.
But one of the faculty had been a Baldrige examiner
Oh,
a couple of years before. I knew what Baldrige was in basically, I'd seen the ads on television from Cadillac and Caterpillar and the others and so forth that
yeah.
had won one of the
Mhm.
early awards.
Yeah.
You obviously know a lot more about that than I do, but um, I remember hearing that idea and I thought, wow, that solves a couple of problems. Nobody's ever done it before. So that would be truly something that would qualify as a BHAG if nobody's ever been able to do it. And secondly,
Mhm.
it's business school. Secondly, then what it would do is I thought, well, now the risk is what if we don't get it? And we kind of played around with that for our leadership team for maybe
Good.
a month or so. And we thought, okay, so let's scenario plan this out.
Mhm.
Even if we don't get it, we're pursuing a system. that actually is designed to make you better the longer you apply it.
Right.
So the longer we could plan ahead, and we thought, okay, it is probably a risky thing, and we might not get that, but we know as a result of pursuing this, we'll be a lot better program than we were once we started. And so we did, and we invited in one of the previous winners of the Baldrige Award. In fact, I think it was the only university that had won at that point, which was a university up in Wisconsin. And we
Yes.
invited their provost in, if you remember, Julie Firstbova. And
Mhm.
the idea there was to figure out, number one, answer the question, could we do this? Were we ready for it, or do we need to wait? And the other thing, though, was we thought, okay, we had one of our executive professors who had worked for, I won't say the name of the company, but he had worked for a Fortune 500 company before he came there as one of their leaders. And he said, you'll never be able to do this. Now, I
Okay.
was disappointed to hear that in our faculty meeting because I thought,
Mhm.
"Wow, here we are, I'm trying to move this forward, and you're like the voice of discontent in terms of steering things back the other way."
Right.
But what I forgot about was psychology, reverse psychology, and by him saying, "You'll never be able to do this," I said, "Well, why would we not be able to do it?" He said, "Because," he said, "we tried for years and we never could win, and if we can't win as this big company, you have no shot at being able to do it."
Mhm.
Meanwhile, the day before that, we had just listened to this previous Baldrige Award winner, and she had told
Mhm.
all of our faculty in one room at the same time, "You don't need to wait on this. I've seen what you've done up to this point." Remember those 2 previous leaders.
Right.
"I've seen if you're ready to do this now, you don't need to wait." So they not only heard that from a previous winner that we were ready to do it, they heard from somebody else who said, "You'll never do it." And
Mhm.
then their, egos kicked in, and they said, "Oh,
Excellent.
no. We'll show you we're gonna do it," right? So that's kinda how we got on that path, and it, basically, and again, this would never have happened if it weren't for those 2 previous leaders and all those years of trying to get better. Finding the Baldrige framework, we thought, "Okay, well, that's probably a 5-year BHAG. Even if we get it, that's a 5-year BHAG." And you'll remember, you came in for our 2nd year after we'd struggled and muddled around the 1st year. We'd gotten better, but you came in the 2nd year and we won that very same year.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
basically, and so that's another thing I think that organizations have to wrestle with. It's a good problem to have in terms of what happens if you get better faster than what you planned, and how do you avoid the downfall off the cliff because, okay, well, now what, right? We don't have very short attention spans anymore these days as
Yeah.
leaders or as employees, or
Mhm.
organizations. So we then spent probably the next 3 years, I think it was at that point, continuing to try to do better, but to be honest, slightly distracted from the fact that now everybody was looking at us, and we were spending a
Mhm.
lot of our time traveling around and trying to help others
Right.
be able to
Right.
achieve their better results too. So it was
Right.
kind of it was good to have won, but it was also something where I thought, what if we had not won as fast? Could we have been even better if we had had that delayed for another 2 or 3 years? Maybe we would have achieved even better results. So that's kind of the in less than a nutshell, more than a
Mhm.
nutshell, I should say. That's kind of a long way of us getting from point A to point B.
Oh,
Wow.
that's fantastic.
That's a
Billy,
great.
what question would you ask? You're hearing the story. What's your first question? What
Well,
would you
you
ask?
said in '94 you got there and you almost immediately bought in. What was the environment like that was created before you by these previous deans that allowed that quick of a buy-in? Because that's what a lot of operations people struggle with is getting that
Yeah.
buy-in.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think for me, and just to be clear, I came in 1990.
Mhm.
1994 was when I became assistant dean. But
Hmm.
I think one of the things I was talking about this with a former colleague just the other day who was there at the time as well. Because we were bemoaning, as you do as you get older, you reminisce about things that, oh, things aren't as good as what they were back, whatever it was,
Hmm.
right? But I remember we were talking about, I said, do they still do this and this? And it was basically all um, team oriented or family oriented events
Mhm.
that kept people together and interacting with each other beyond just their roles as employees. So, for example, they would have a Christmas party once a year where all of the faculty and staff and their spouses and families, kids too, would come together and would spend time with one another, season's greetings kinds of things, right? This was
Mhm.
not a religious organization per se, but they were all very good people and had
Mhm.
good values that matched mine and my family's. And so when I saw that, they in the spring they do a picnic. where all of the faculty and the leaders actually cook for all of the students,
Mhm.
and hot dogs, hamburgers, that kind of thing. And we do it
Right.
at, we have awards for students and faculty, but we do it as a very informal outdoor picnic type of it. So it was that types of things. It was the collegiality of people going to lunch together. So you
Hmm.
see maybe why they were their wardrobes were expanding in terms of size, I guess, the more we're talking about food. But um, there was a lot of that that was attractive to me. And then the other thing was I had just come from a place where I thought we were marching toward the same goal of accreditation. And
Mhm.
then upper leadership came in and basically um, got rid of the dean overnight, literally got rid of the senior leader. And so
Mhm.
we had all brought in to chase this vision. And now that vision was gone because the new president made clear we're not going to do this anymore. So we
Hmm.
all jettisoned and left. We went to Georgetown, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, um, all sorts of institutions all over the country. And so it was like this great dispersion of people. I ended up going to University of Northern Colorado because I thought I would love to live in Colorado at some point. And I found these people who seemed to match my values where I thought it'd be a good place to raise
Mhm.
my kids. So I think there's figuring out some way, if you can, where there's already, you can see the direction the organization is headed, ideally. You can say,
Mhm.
do I fit in with where that direction is headed? That's one. And then I think is, do I fit well with the people? Could I be, could I picture myself and or my family and my family being a part of this where I think there's a good alignment between this organization, and it's always risky because those things can change over time, right? As
Mhm.
you're talking
Mhm.
about. But I think to be brought in to say, here's a new idea we've had about moving forward, we're going to change everything up. That's not nearly as attractive as I can actually see the evidence that they're already on their way to doing that. And I think that's what it was for me.
Oh, that's awesome. You know,
Yeah.
one other question that I really have to ask because you did this over such a time frame, like it was just over and over again. And I've done this with a few companies myself,
Mhm.
and we always hit that brick wall every so often.
Yeah.
It was just be like,
Yeah.
smack, we're not going forward anymore. What
Yeah.
techniques did you use as a leader to get over that brick wall, to continue that grind, that journey to move forward?
And you're right. There certainly were obstacles like that. There were times where, and this is not me per se, but I can recall a previous leader where maybe somebody the higher administrative level would threaten to come in and divert your direction in terms of your BHAG goal that you were pursuing.
Hmm.
And this guy, this guy wasn't identical to me. The first dean was and I were not identical. He's deceased at this point. Um, but he had it. He actually, I'll have like a quote from a Maxwell or C.S. Lewis or somebody on my office wall. He would have a quote from Genghis Khan in terms of enemies and how you treat enemies and so forth. I
Hmm.
thought, wow, that's kind of different. So he was not at all averse to even at times some Machiavellian
Hmm.
techniques to be able to get. So he would basically maybe get one of the board members who was a friend of his to come in and put a little pressure on the upper senior leader of the university to be able to pull them back in. So there were brick walls certainly that came up. The
Hmm.
biggest one that I had was the first year that I became dean. Number one, 9/11 happened, and that was kind of a shock to the system. But the other thing that happened that same year, we received a 10% budget cut for our fiscal year.
Hmm.
The problem was that weren't notified of it until December of the year, which is the middle of our fiscal year. So in effect, we had a 100% budget for the fall. We had an 80% budget for the spring. And the
Hmm.
only way that we were going to be able to continue move forward to get past that is we had to figure out how do we cut 20% of our funding. It was a 1 year cut, thankfully, but the state was having some fiscal issues. Well, that
Mhm.
qualified, I think, as a brick wall. We basically agreed that all of the leaders would step in. The only way you can cut that much in a short amount of time is you shave off your instructional staffing. And so we
Hmm.
cut a lot of our classes, or would have had to cut a lot of our classes to harvest that money back. But to fill those classes, since we didn't have money to staff them, the leaders stepped in, and all of us agreed to teach an additional course as well. The dean, for example, wasn't teaching anything at that point because your full time was focused on doing these other administrative
Mhm.
things. But I thought, I've got to be willing to step up as well, if for no other reason than to set an example for the rest of the people
Hmm.
there that it's shared pain for us getting through this. So every time something major like that came up, we were not averse to figuring out, okay, what could we do, even if it's painful for some of us to be able to get the job done? And we stepped up and did that. And there were people who came back later and told me, it stunk that I had to go back and teach that extra class because that was basically a 25% increase in their teaching load. But it helped knowing that other people were in there with me sharing the same pain. So there's always going to be things like that that come up that are unexpected. And then figuring out, you just have to be innovative, I guess, on some of these things too.
Mhm.
The BHAG, though, certainly meant that there was pursuing the Baldrige by the time I became dean, there was very little. There's very little funding required to be able to do that. So if resources were the limitation in terms of these brick walls, as long as you could keep the upper administration above me at bay, we didn't really have any financial impediments that anymore could impact us enough to keep us from continuing to march forward if we could just get through short-term hurdles.
Wow.
Right.
Please, later on when you have free time, I need you to write a book about how to deal with a leader that quotes Sun Tzu, The Art of War, while you're quoting The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I would read that book in an instant. That would be
You've
great.
read that book, and that's good. Yeah,
And
yeah,
that leads to this good point. So this is a 20-year journey from 1984 to 2004 when you won the Baldrige
yeah,
Award.
yeah.
And I know part of what you had said is that each dean
Mhm.
said, "What am I going to do during my deanship
Right,
to make the college significantly better and stay better even after me?" So each dean had its mission.
right,
And could you talk more about what role did strategy, because people don't stay in a common direction unless they have a common purpose that they believe in, and the whole organization, and sometimes
Right.
people outside there have to believe in. So how did you get that to happen within the College of Business when the other colleges, even within the University of Northern Colorado, weren't doing it?
right,
This is the only college that's ever won the Baldrige Award, so we can think of all the colleges.
right.
How did you get that to happen, and what role did strategy play?
Yeah, and again, if the most condensed way I was able to communicate this to students was I talked about strategies being the path we take to get from point A to point B, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I like to use military examples from time to time too. So I would talk about Patton and World
It
War.
sounds like he's come over to the other side, Billy.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah,
He's got his war examples
yeah,
now too.
exactly. And the thing is, Patton would probably have more in common with Genghis Khan. Back to that
Mhm.
analogy as well, right? But the thing I found was, and again, I didn't create this. This started with the first dean who was building this culture. He came up with this little slogan, which is a marketing professor myself. I mean, I loved this. And I knew about this when I made the decision to
Mhm,
come there as a faculty member. It was just three parts, three-legged stool, high touch, wide tech, professional depth.
mhm.
High touch, wide tech, professional depth. You think, oh, that sounds nice, but I have no idea what that means. Okay. High touch meant that you were in terms of how you delivered your product of education to your students. We're going to have a very personalized type of instructional approach. In a day and age when a lot of our peers were just moving to mass class sizes, our neighbor down the road in Boulder, I remember us benchmarking them at one point, and their average business class size was 380 something, right? 380.
Mhm.
Now, try being personalized when you have a room full of 380 people that you're trying to. So, um, basically, what we did, we went the opposite way. In fact, when the first team redid the building, it's sort of like they're doing with these stadiums nowadays. They're making the stadiums smaller, right? But they're increasing the quality of the experience for the fans who come in there. So it's
Mhm.
luxury boxes, things like that. So he basically redesigned the building from big classrooms to small ones. So our average class size to be high touch was around 20, right? So you compare
Wow.
380 to 20.
Smokes.
Now think about as a teacher, what would allow you to do a better job of teaching your students? Trying to meet the needs of 300 plus or just 20 that you could, I mean, now all of a sudden you
Mhm.
can personalize
Yeah.
your approach. You get to know all the students. Everybody knows each other by
Mhm.
name. So that was one. There were other metrics on that too, but small class size one. Wide tech, and notice it wasn't high tech; it was wide tech. We don't want it to be a place of computers. We want to be a place where a wide array of existing and emerging business technologies that are being discovered and deployed in business around the country and later around the world. Um, Those were things that we wanted our students to not experience for the first time once they graduated and went to work for that company. So the
Mhm.
extent we could have them familiar with the computers, and this is before the days of apps, even the programs that they'd be likely to interface with. We wanted them to learn how to do that before they got. And think about what a quicker learning curve they would have in terms of going out to work for an employer if they already knew how to do these tools before they graduated. We did even um, well, and that's probably enough on that. It's wide tech. Professional depth meant that we wanted them to not just be book smart, but we wanted them to be exposed to current business practice. So again, if you think about how textbooks are written, oftentimes by the time you get them in print, it's 3 years out of date from whatever's being done, especially nowadays with as fast as everything's changing.
Mhm.
So what we did is we started saying, okay, how could we get people more how could we eliminate that gap between where they are here sitting in a classroom in Colorado
Mhm.
and the profession they're going to enter once they graduate? I thought one of the ways we can do that is we can bring these leaders in to our college to help teach the students. And so we actually had we hired in the governor and vice chair of NASDAQ one year to be a visiting professor, and he stayed for several years. We had the
Mm.
CEO of Security Traders Association to come in to live on campus and teach our students. So we most of the time we had at least three executive professors who had just left their role as senior leaders where they were, and they're then interacting and teaching classes with our regular faculty. And we would have guest speakers who would come in. Back to the war thing. I remember Alexander Haig being brought in from
Oh my
former
goodness.
Secretary of Defense. We had some of the people that I see now on CNBC and or Fox Business. I'll see them. I'll think, wow, they were at our school visiting all those years ago. So a lot of the people who were government officials or business leaders would be brought on campus to work with their students. They got exposed to some of those things. The other thing we did is I thought about early this morning. It popped into my head. We thought, well, students don't read enough. We should have them reading current business publications. It was even worse now, but this is even
Yeah.
back then, 20 plus years ago. We thought, what
Mhm.
if we bought them each a subscription to the Wall Street Journal? And this was
Oh.
kind of a temporary program that the Wall Street Journal had at the time, again, back early 2000s. They said, what if, and they said, would you like to be one of our pilot schools to try this new program? I said, what is it? And they said, we can, for a fixed amount of money for your college, and again, they're not a nonprofit either. They said, if you'll invest this money, we raise the money externally to do it, then you can program in what your students are taking that semester on their schedule, and we will build a customized newspaper for each of them,
Oh my goodness.
electronic, right? That they can
Yeah.
have that correlates with the content that they're learning in their classes.
Oh my
They can
goodness.
imagine like being able to know that when you come to class that morning, if you've done what you're supposed to, and we've eliminated all the obstacles for you being able to do it if you choose, um, you can actually have already read through stories that were happening that day or the day before that relate to the content you're being taught in those your classes that semester, right? Now you can be exposed to a normal newspaper, but
Yeah.
this we thought, wow,
Oh
that's
yeah.
an advantage because they're probably not going to read the whole thing from cover to cover,
Mhm. Mhm.
but it have them reading the stories at least that relate to what they're learning in their classes.
Mhm.
That's probably a pretty good plus. So are things like that we did that were designed to increase their exposure to the profession that they were going to enter upon graduation. So all that to say this, I didn't create that. That was started with the very first dean, and he loved that slogan, and that
Wow.
drew me. That helped draw me and other faculty. And the other thing you have to think about is to your earlier question, Billy, when you over time, if you can figure out a way to get the same basic strategy and values over time, the people you want to be there to be on that bus will be drawn to that because
Mhm.
you didn't pull the rug out from underneath them, 2 years after they got there and change something else into a different direction. The other thing that David hadn't brought up yet, but I know he knows this fact. Since I left in 2007, so we're approaching 20 years,
Yeah.
23 years for three deans, three senior leaders. It's now been almost 20 years since I left, and they have had, I've lost count, it's somewhere between 12 and 15 deans.
Wow.
You say,
Oh my.
well, if you were that successful, how come it didn't continue? And the answer is because in the end, you're still subject to the powers that be above you.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
David will remember this pretty well. We had changed so much from where we had started. we'd gotten a lot better. But the problem was a lot of the units that were still on campus had not changed all that much. So you imagine a senior leader, it's sort of like if you to put it in a family situation, imagine a parent who's got like, 7, 8 kids
Yeah,
and
and a
one
prodigal son, eh?
and one
Mhm.
kid that goes out and just does either bad or good, right, can impact things, but they do really well and they but now so how you can do that? Are you going to put that child up on a pedestal so the other kids will follow along and try to be like them? Or you say, I don't like them getting all that attention. Let's cut them down a few notches to where they're all back to the same level again. And that's kind of what began to happen. New senior leaders were chosen instead of us being able to continue the same path with the same values. They brought in people from the outside to be able to take it back a different direction. And one of the first things they did was they added an MBA program back into the mix. Then they began to do this. So basically, the very things we had done to try to make things better, they systematically began dismantling. One president began dismantling, and to the point where even when the new president came in, a lot of the people who had been there, who had bought into our vision, they had by that point retired or moved on. So it's hard to do anything like that, sustain it for too long, unless you can basically, like you said, brick walls. That's a pretty big brick wall. It was a brick
Mhm.
ceiling in that case that we couldn't broach.
But what made it happen for 20 years
Hmm.
was that you had a common vision and your focus
Right.
appeared to be a very important part of it.
Right.
And if I remember, focus on excellence, and if I remember, because it was presented for the Baldrige to win the award, that there is
Hmm.
some sort of test for bachelor's degree business people,
Hmm.
business students to take that's a national test that
Right.
rates how well they learn the subject of business,
Yeah.
and that you were what in the that Mumford College of Business was in the 95%, so they were up in the
Hmm.
same level as Harvard and all the other big schools,
Yeah.
and were significantly less expensive. Am I remembering that correctly, Joe?
Yeah, that's pretty close. That's pretty close to what it was. That was something that we had actually, to meet our accreditation standards, my predecessor, Bob, had put in place to say, okay, this looks to be a pretty important metric for whether or not we're delivering on our mission and tracking our progress. And
Mhm.
so he put in, so every graduating senior had to take that test. And it was accounting, it was
And this
management,
is a graduating undergraduate senior.
graduating undergraduate tests. You're right.
Mhm.
And so we thought, oh, we're getting pretty good. We started, we weren't all that good, but by the the late 90s, early 2000s, we were performing at probably if I remember right, 70th, 75th percentile. Thought, well, that sounds good. That's way above average. In fact, David will remember this story too, but I remember an examiner coming in and looking at our comparison metric we were using to evaluate our success. And
Mhm.
we had reported the averages across all these areas, and we had shown how we were above averages, right? Thought,
Mhm.
wow, look at us. This is good. And I remember the examiner writing in our feedback report, they said, if you're trying to remember how they tongue in cheek said it, but it was something along the lines of, if your goal is to be above average, you have succeeded.
You're in the top 50%.
Uh-huh.
Yes. And that was their way of saying, okay, congratulations, but I thought your vision was to be the best undergraduate business program in the state of Colorado. Those don't sound like those are aligned in terms of your vision and what you're measuring. I
Mhm.
thought, that's a fairly once we got a
Right,
little bit defensive about it, we thought they're right. And so
right.
that was the first year that we were applying for Baldrige, and we thought, yeah, that's not good. And so we moved it up. We set a goal of being in the top 10%, figuring that's the best we had. They
And
didn't tell you.
this is of all the business colleges in the country, right?
Well, it's all the business colleges who are serious enough about their programs to administer
So
this test.
all of the bigger business
It
colleges.
was
Yeah,
200, I don't know, 220 or 230 different institutions that did this.
which would include the Harvards and the MITs
I
and
don't
the
remember for sure. I don't know that Harvard did that because, I mean, after all, when you're Harvard, it's like, why do I need a test? I'm Harvard.
but they were some of the most
There
significant
were
business schools in the
some of the
country.
top ones that were doing it for sure. But we thought, that's our way of, Harvard can go out and just say we're Harvard and give people a free sweatshirt, and they probably are going to come there in some cases. But in our case, we thought we got to we got to basically be a little more persuasive, and so maybe we need to be able to show to parents and employers that we are delivering a quality education. So we would look at where people were when they came in as freshmen on their ACT or SAT score, and we'd look at where they were on our exam. We figured out a way to bridge those to show that there was basically here was the net improvement from where they started and where they were when they graduated. And so that's kind of what we use. The other thing that before we leave all of the journey too far in the rearview mirror, um, I remember that when I left in '07, we were at, I think we had 2 or 3 areas where we were at the 95th percentile, but a lot on average we're at the 90th percentile. So we'd made our top
Mhm.
10%.
Yeah.
We got even better though for the next 2 to 3 years after I left. And it's that analogy, David, you and I have talked about before, of a
Mhm.
boat that once you get it turned, and then if you can put the juice in of the motor and you
Mhm.
start making momentum building up, even if you totally take off the throttle, it's going to continue to move forward. It may even accelerate for a brief amount of time. And so
Right.
even though they started, so I think that can work for you and against you. The students are certainly getting good value for their degrees and what they're paying in tuition. But the other thing is, it's a delayed signal that you're actually starting to
Right.
slow down.
Right.
And I don't think they didn't connect the dots between the leadership change and some other things and the fact that, oh no, it's not going to sustain because you're no
Right.
longer doing a lot of the things that were you doing that got you there.
So the idea that you got to keep focused on sustained improvement, and every dean was committed. I'm going to
Yeah.
make a sustainable improvement during my deanship, and
Right.
then the next dean's going to build on it. The next dean's going to
Yeah.
build on. And then we're gonna be able to tell parents, "We can provide you the best undergraduate business education in the country at probably among the lowest price, and
Right.
therefore we are demonstratably," and you
Yeah.
demonstrated this at Baldrige, "we are the best buy in undergraduate business education in
Yeah.
the country."
That's what we
And
bragged
here's the
about.
data to support it from third-party testaments. So, I
Exactly.
mean, get that.
And the other thing, just real quickly, let me add this in because I thought this is important too. And I've been trying to teach this in other audiences that I've been working with of late. Um, there's a tendency in life for you to view people as your police. I don't know a better way to say it. This doesn't have anything to do with politics, but when you think about, oh, they're there to watch me to make sure that I measure up to how tall I'm supposed to be for meeting
Okay.
their
You mean
standards,
like
right?
outside assessors and things like
Outside assessors, but for
and
us,
and
it
and
was accredited
accreditation bodies in Baldrige.
accreditation bodies, it was, senior leadership in the university, it was parents of students, it was
Mhm.
employers.
Wow.
All those people we
Employer,
felt like were overseeing us and saying they would ask us questions. "How do we know that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing? And prove it to us." So the ETS test was one way that we could prove it, right? The thing we kind of figured out accidentally almost was, if you set a standard for yourself and for your organization that is so above what anybody else would expect to hold you to, they no longer have to portray that role of being your overseers, your police. Now they're freed up to say, what am I here for? They're already, we're trying to assure they're this tall, they're performing this tall. I don't need to expend any energy to help make sure they meet my minimum level. How
Mhm.
tall, you must be this tall to ride this ride. That's the thing that pops into my head, right? So what it did was those same people who were before were our basically our enemy is too strong a word, but now
Mhm.
they were our partner because they said, "Wow, this is contagious." Once you show that you're interested in doing something that's this outstanding, you start you start firing up. It's like a winning football team, right? Look at
Mhm.
Indiana University right now in terms of the year they've had. There's all sorts of people now fans of theirs, right? Before they were critical, now they're like, "Wow, that's really good. I want to help them do what I can help them to be
Right.
able to achieve this higher level, this higher standard because it's so unique." No one wants to do that. No one's willing to expend that amount of energy to be at that level. We had talked before about memorable things from the Achieving World Class Results class, and I think you and I had said that was maybe one thing we wanted to make sure we talked about today. The thing that stuck with me was wherever you shoot for in terms of how good you want to be, you'll likely be somewhere underneath that.
Mhm. Yes. Yeah, you set the limit by what you're shooting for.
Yeah.
You
So
you'll be equal to or worse than what you accept.
if you want to target excellence, okay, maybe you'll be good, right? You might be excellent, but it's very few that reach that level even, right?
Mhm.
But if you shoot for what was it, 100% ride, 100% of the time at 100% speed, right?
Absolutely.
If
Mhm.
you shoot for that, well, that gives you a chance to be excellent, right? You
Mhm.
may not be perfect. You may not be able to do that all the time, but you'll at least be better than you'll be better than good just by virtue of the fact you're looking for something far better than what most people are even considering or dreaming about being for your organization.
And that was one of the keys for Monfort College of Business
Mhm.
to be
Yeah,
able to become the only Baldrige winning college of business and to be demonstrably the best buy in undergraduate business education in the country.
right. Yeah, that
What
was a
is
good
it? Oh man, and I mean, you can tell how excited. I wish we could even talk longer, but I know we're beginning to run out of time. So
yeah,
that's such a great place to summarize it.
yeah,
And thank you for sharing this, Joe. This
yeah.
is
Thank you for
Mhm.
the opportunity.
and I have to tell you, it was wonderful to be able to see, particularly for that year that we worked together,
Mhm.
your up close leadership and how, as some of the things that Billy was asking, how you really handled to keep everybody on board
Right,
and keep everybody pushing,
right.
and this dedication to ours is to be the role model in the country, not to be just a good business school.
Absolutely,
And we're
absolutely.
not going to let the fact that we have less resources than other
Right,
people be the
right,
discriminator. We
right.
can use the resources we have, and of course, we can work to get more
Yeah,
resources, but they're
you
limited.
you
To
need some
be
resources.
excellent, period. That's
Yeah,
our
you need
goal.
some resources, but you don't need to be
Yeah.
wealthy to be able to do excellent things, right? Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, Joe, this is so inspiring, and
Good.
thank you for sharing this, and thank you for being the kind of leader. And I know it's not just Mumford College of Business; you do this with every place you're involved in. So
Yeah.
thank you for being the kind of leader that's absolutely dedicated to excellence, and then makes it happen.
I appreciate it, David. Thank you, and thank you, Billy, for, spending some time with me this morning. This was fun to share things.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you. And to everybody who listens to the Operations Expert podcast, we drop new episodes every first and third Monday of every month. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Good deal.
Take care.
Operations Experts was created by McClaskey Excellence Institute. Hosts were David McClaskey, president of McClaskey Excellence Institute, and Billy Schaefer, vice president of McClaskey Excellence Institute. The podcast was produced and edited by Kate Craig of Kate Craig Consulting. New episodes drop the first and third Monday of every month on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, Amazon Music. Find us online at McClaskeyExcellence.com and register for our Achieving World Class Results course to enable your organization to deliver exactly what you promised every time using extraordinary operations.